All right, let's get started. Welcome. Actually, I want to start the session with a shocking revelation. I'm not Ari Zilka. In the long version of the program, it says that Ari is the speaker. That's obviously patently untrue. If you have the short version or the online version, of course, it's correct. So I'm Jürgen Urbanski. What I'm going to share today draws largely on my experiences of the last couple of years as the enterprise CTO of Deutsche Telekom, the largest European telco, also owns T-Mobile. And I also got quite a bit of an insight on what other folks are doing in my role as a board member of Bitkom, the IT Industry Association. So this session today focuses really on more of the business side of Hadoop, the organizational side. The tech's really not the problem. It's really around how do you get alignment with the people, the processes, the culture, the organizational dynamics. So what you're going to hear from me today is a little bit about what does the journey to a data-driven organization look like? What are the stages? What are some of the challenges? We'll then talk about 21 use cases specifically for telco. So by telco, I mean service providers, but also relevant for MSOs and maybe for media companies. And then we're going to wrap it up by looking at some lessons learned across that journey. So overall, at Deutsche Telekom and probably at many other organizations, the journey kind of at the 30,000-foot flying elevation, it's really a journey in 4 phases, right? So it starts with you're evaluating Hadoop, both on the technical side and on the business side. And then you quickly move towards your first point deployment, your first point use case, and you're starting to get some operational value out of Hadoop, and that's great. And that generates excitement to do more. And doing more really is around moving Hadoop to an enterprise-wide shared service, a data lake, and in such an enterprise-wide deployment, you're starting to create strategic value from Hadoop. You notice that there's a little circle here on stage 2. So sometimes, of course, you have more than one point deployment popping up in different parts of the organization. That's fine, and that shows the enthusiasm for Hadoop, broadly speaking. But you really don't reinvent the wheel, right? So the lessons learned from your first use case, try and scale that out to much more of an enterprise-wide deployment as soon as you can. And then some organizations reach industry leadership. I'm not claiming by any means that Deutsche Telekom is there. But that really, in my mind, signifies 2 things. One is Hadoop and big data and the real-time insights from that become so pervasive that you're actually starting to pull away from the pack in terms of business performance. And then secondly, it also, for some, it means playing an active role in the open source community, maybe open source some of what you're doing and really giving back. So what does success really look like with Hadoop? I apologize if you're sitting in rows 3 to 100. You probably can't see this, but I'll just point out some highlights here. So there's different levels of success depending on who you ask, right? The top executive team, the line of business, the analytic and apps folks, the data management and security folks, as well as the infrastructure folks. And if we kind of skip the evaluation stage here and go straight to operational value, at that stage, really from the top down, there is sponsorship to expand the use. And likely at that stage, you start to get real value out of at least one use case. Typically, the use cases we see, they fall into one of 4 broad buckets, right? One is customer intimacy, which is all the marketing and sales stuff. 2 is more around operational excellence. 3 is more around governance, risk, compliance, security. And then 4 is around using Hadoop and big data for new and adjacent businesses, including stuff where data becomes the product. So odds are you're already doing one of those there. If you look at the analytic and apps layer, what's going on is 80% of the time there, you'll still be in a mode where your existing BI and EDW tools access data on Hadoop natively, probably just one use case, but you're already landing more and more data in Hadoop, more and more data sources across more and more time periods that starts to land in Hadoop. And if you had to ask, so who is actually using Hadoop at that early stage? Well, probably maybe a dozen or so people are using it, and many of them will be in one silo. You are benefiting from schema on read, and you'll clearly have at least one production environment. Okay, so that's fine. Now, it gets more interesting as we move to stage 3. So stage 3 is really Hadoop as an enterprise-wide shared service. It's the data lake. At that point, hopefully, from the top, you start to see sponsorship to transform the organization with all that Hadoop can, in fact, do. And not only is the CXO seeing some value, but the value that you get starts to become material. It starts to become sizable, and so it's sort of like a flywheel that catches more and more momentum. So you're not just realizing value in several areas, you're actually tracking and measuring that. Some people are good about doing this from the get-go. Others only formalize the measurement over time. And there at the analytics and apps layer, really the goal is to say, let's make Hadoop consumable by any department worldwide. And making it consumable is not just a technical matter, but it also has a process and governance dimension to it. And there clearly you will have some new apps at the latest at that stage. You will have some new analytic apps that run natively on Hadoop, and you'll have many, many, many use cases and different processing engines, and you may have an emerging data science team. You probably will have an emerging data science team. And if someone said, well, how many users do we have? Well, the thing that really, where you get your large user counts is in the beneficiaries of Hadoop and the consumers of Hadoop. Your actual IT admin and ops team, you can have a giant cluster with a fairly small team. So in that sense, that doesn't really grow that much. And likewise, data science, you're likely to have a fairly small team. But certainly, you might have hundreds of users already consuming the insights from Hadoop and benefiting from that. And certainly at that stage, if you look at data management and security, you need to institute some governance because all of a sudden, more data is shared, and that implies a certain amount of collaboration, but also governance around how you share that data. And at that point, yes, you will have Hadoop as a multi-tenant shared service, and that also means you likely need some sort of a service desk to onboard these successive waves of users and use cases. And then finally, some folks get to stage 4. I would argue today, probably the only organizations at stage 4 are some of the large pure-play online businesses that have been talking here at this event extensively. And there, it stands to reason if really data is the new gold, is the new oil, is the new capital, it stands to reason that you ought to manage data as professionally as capital, right? So for capital, organizations have a CFO, they have a finance function, that discipline from the finance function gets pushed to the front line with things like budgeting. And it stands to reason that here you do need a CDO, a chief data officer, or similar. That's actually part of your executive team. So it's no longer enough just to have someone who's a CDO that is a data steward, looking after data quality and master data management and those things. That's certainly fine, but at that point you do need one of the business leaders to step up and say, yes, let's manage this as professionally as we manage data. And this also means that the intelligence from Hadoop is pushed to the front line. Increasingly, you're taking some of your real-time or quasi-real-time decisions are driven by those insights, and that creates substantial value, really, and you're on your way towards a data-driven culture. At that stage, you probably do have a high-performing data science team, and you also see an interesting dynamic that these use cases start to build upon each other. So what started out as a collection of singular use cases and singular new apps starts to become more like an application landscape, so more and more value is being created. And you have to think about, okay, so what incentives do we provide to encourage the generation of data, the sharing of it, the consumption of it? So, what's the incentive model behind this? And of course, like I mentioned, do you give back some of what you do to the community? When you're at the early stages, clearly, you have a small team of Hadoop enthusiasts. You need the architects on board, the IT ops team on board. You need to loop in the security people. And there's quite a bit of change, so you probably need to borrow some resources from your change and program management. That's not so particularly insightful, but what happens when you build this out to an enterprise-wide shared service, all of a sudden the game changes a little bit, because not only do you need, if I go on the top right, an architect, you're also starting to manage Hadoop like any other IT service. So things like IT service portfolio management, building out a roadmap, that starts to matter. If you go here to the bottom left, on the business side of things, because of the early enthusiasm here for your Hadoop, you're being bombarded with a wave of interests and a wave of potential use cases. So I would argue you actually need a sort of a demand management and advocacy team to help all these different business owners understand the value that Hadoop provides and how they get the most value out of it. Likewise, no longer enough just to have an infrastructure admin team. You probably also need the equivalent of a service desk, help desk kind of function here. And then further on to the right, I already mentioned data science and machine learning. One important insight, and Deutsche Telekom didn't get this one right, is so to really make Hadoop pervasive and create most value, it's really, really important that the person that leads these efforts really, I would argue, ought to be at an SVP level. The most common reporting would be reporting directly to a group CIO. Because what happens when that's not the case is then it's very hard to drive some of the governance and some of the systemic change if this whole thing sits too far down in the organization, right?
Quick question. On the previous slide, you make a point about your role, the CDO.
Mm-hmm.
That is really the role of the CIO, right? As the chief information officer, he's supposed to make sure the information, which is really data,
Mm-hmm.
is being used appropriately across the organization. So now we include this new role. I mean, I'm just wondering how many companies would want to fund that kind of a role, and what's the intersection between the CIO and the CDO?
Sure.
Obviously, there's some.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, my sense is it's very much an emerging role. I spoke at one event recently that had a lot of Fortune 1000 sort of organizations, and I said, and it was called the Chief Data Officer Summit, and I said, well, how many of you are actually Chief Data Officers? And 2 hands went up in a room like this, right? So it's clearly an emerging role. Some organizations like Bank of New York Mellon have it, and it reports directly to the group CIO. And it could be called different things. We're not getting hung up on what it's called, but the basic point is it needs to be someone who really takes a business leadership view to it, not just a plumbing and master data management and data quality view, right? And it could conceivably sit, depending on your business, it could conceivably sit on the business side, like maybe on the marketing side or retail, online operations, what have you. But the challenge when it sits in one of the businesses, that's like the anchor tenant, is there's always going to be suspicion from the other businesses around, okay, well, I'm not in marketing or online. Am I really going to get the attention I want? Am I going to get the services I want as this builds out to become more of a platform as a service sort of modular stack? So there's that suspicion. And likewise, if it sits in one of these business units, there's going to be potentially a disconnect around, okay, well, let's make sure the funding model is in place because, if it sits in business A, that business has to come up with some of the investment at least that really serves the other parts of the business. So you have to have those things sorted out, right? So at that point, stage 3, you are in fact moving towards a data lake. What is a data lake really? It's really a situation where you're able to provide any authorized user with interactive and almost real-time insight because you have a whole host of use cases running. Very often these start to build upon each other. You see here how they're connected like an application landscape. And you can really bring the right processing engine to the right job, right? So things like not just Pig and Hive, but also things like Storm, things like search and discovery, things like graph processing. So it's almost like you have different arrows in your quiver, and depending on the problem, you can pick the one that's just right. And of course, this runs on a common pool of data, and so the net effect is you can run multiple, it's almost like Platforma calls these lenses, right? So multiple lenses on one common pool of data, and that's really, so that's kind of cool. So how do I get there? Well, if you think about some of the requirements here in a more departmental siloed world, stage 2 on the left, some of those things that start, I mean, so it's fairly simple. So security is largely achieved by restricting the number of people who can access this, and the physics of it provide a certain level of protection. Typically, when you get going, Hadoop is kind of a best effort service, service tier number 5, which means good luck, best efforts, no SLAs, no promises, right? And the data is largely owned by each department, so it's sort of like a data hugger kind of motion, and that also implies some of the things like, getting security sign-offs, that's fairly easy because it's all siloed. Getting a compliance sign-off, well, you know exactly what the use case is, and there's a pool of a little puddle of data, I should say, fairly easy. But when you move to this enterprise-wide shared service, the dynamics changes. So clearly then you're saying this is a multi-tenant service with appropriate resource isolation and so forth, and it's great that Yarn actually provides that, so that's a huge plus. But you need to really start to think more about the data security, the data governance, the data workflows, because the average organization is subject to dozens and maybe hundreds of different compliance regimes across the world. And so all of a sudden, as this data flows into one lake, it's no longer quite as straightforward to say, oh, well, for this little puddle, all that matters is regulation A, B, and C. So you have to be more thoughtful about that in the data lake. And that gets us to the data privacy, the policy, and the compliance. Likewise, the consumption models, just like for virtual infrastructure, you have now a consumption model where there's self-service and there's chargebacks or showbacks. You also expect that to see with Hadoop at that stage. And you need to think about your model of consuming and producing data. So if my department produces some data and I make that available to you, to your department, well, you start to rely on that. And how do we sort of communicate about the equivalent of what's the API on the data in the sense of the stability, the availability? Maybe I'll change formats one day and I forgot to tell you, and whoops, all of a sudden your application trips over, and lo and behold, maybe that's an application that you rely on where it's not just a batch analytics thing where it's like, oh, too bad, I'm annoyed, but maybe it's already an app where some sort of real-time insight gets pushed to the field, to the salespeople, to the service people. So you don't want that to trip over just because my department decides to change the data sources, the formats, or what have you, right? So you see the equivalent of a sort of service level or API stability emerge on the data concerning the availability, the stability, the quality, the formats, et cetera. And then finally, operational processes. So clearly at that point, Hadoop becomes somewhat business critical, maybe even very business critical. So it starts to appear more like a tier 3, tier 2 service with the SLAs, the RPO, the RTO, disaster recovery, all those considerations start to matter. But it's worth it, not to overburden the complexity, but it is worth it because you're getting, number one, a lot more operational benefits out of having this as a shared service, very much analogous to your private cloud infrastructure that may be on-premise. And then secondly, you get a lot more benefit because of these lenses, right? So the value compounds exponentially as you have more use cases, more time periods, et cetera. So that's actually very powerful. Okay, now how do you actually consume Hadoop? There are different waves. Usually I recommend to start with the wave with the kind of stuff that has the least amount of organizational complexity. Many CIOs start with stuff that is only constrained to IT to minimize the complexity. So it's operational cost savings in areas like Active Archive or Enterprise Data Warehouse. But then fairly soon you're migrating towards actually genuinely new applications that run natively on Hadoop, and increasingly these will leverage data science and machine learning, and certainly lots of sessions here at the conference to learn about that. And I would argue from a business perspective, the stuff on the left becomes table stakes fairly soon. People just running BI on Hadoop data, that becomes table stakes. So to really outperform, you really have to get into those line of business apps to create the most amount of value. And that's actually a good segue into our next chapter, which is 21 telco use cases for Hadoop. And broadly, those use cases fall into 4 big buckets. One is network infrastructure, where Hadoop is relevant to the entire life cycle of a network, starting with things like capacity planning, then actually deploying and rolling out the network, all the way to maintenance and upgrades of the network. The second big bucket here really is service and security. Security, of course, it cuts across everything, so it's sort of horizontal. But if you think about the customer service piece, it's the productivity of your call center, it's the productivity of your field-based service people, but also you can use it for things like data protection and compliance and end user and device security, right? Then sales and marketing, that's a huge bucket. The anchor use case here is a 360-degree view of your customers. And on that, or based on that, you can run things like much more personalized campaigns, next best offers, you can do churn prevention, and a whole host of very interesting use cases. And then finally, we have new and adjacent businesses. Clearly, this is being used for new product development internally as you get real-time feedback on adoption. But also, you can serve that intelligence out, for instance, to advertisers, to merchants, to payment processors, or to federal and local governments. Now, at some telcos, there's a lot of excitement around this last bucket, new business. But I actually argue that a much bigger impact, a much bigger lever comes from the first three, because that's the core business. So if you're having a several $billion a year cost base in any of these first three, and you're getting maybe the single-digit % improvement, that's huge. You're talking like lots of money, right? Versus on the new and adjacent business, okay, so you're going to basically serve out the insight in what appears to be some sort of a real-time market intelligence service. Most people might pay about, if you think about the people who are paying for this, maybe you're selling it for a couple $100,000 a year. Maybe you're lucky, a few customers are paying $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. So if you do the math, then at least on this last bucket, you might end up with a $50 million, $100 million business top line. It's not bad. It's good, but it's not nearly moving the needle as much as applying Hadoop to the core business. So clearly, we can't go into all 21, but I wanted to just share a couple highlights. If you're interested in all 21, then come see me afterwards. But for instance, network capacity planning. So clearly, all the telcos are upgrading both their mobile network to 4G as well as the fixed network, either fiber to the curb or fiber to the home. And there's one example of a European operator who basically used the insights from Hadoop to optimize the network investment. So in other words, how much CapEx gets deployed, exactly where, and optimize that in time and space. And the outcome was that they were able to spend 10% less CapEx, 10% less money in a given year for exactly the same ultimate outcome in terms of coverage and customer set and so forth. So that's huge. And that applies just in the same way to the fixed network as it applies to the mobile network, right? So that's one example of, wow, you're spending several billion a year on network rollouts. If you could optimize that just by a little bit, that's huge, right? Second example here is network upgrades. And so this is a cable network example and sort of the bubble chart. And what's going on here is, so the business problem was, okay, so where is my network most congested, which I can find out with my existing tools. But how does that relate to the customer experience? How does it relate to churn? And so here, the idea was to merge 11 different data sources from two broad universes. One universe clearly was, you could say it's sort of the business side of things, so the call center voice to text, the work orders from the trucks running around in the field, data from the mobile devices, from the customer premise equipment, et cetera. And merge that with data that really comes from the network, things like Tivoli net performance management tools, as well as call detail records, or in this case, in the cable industry, it's IP detail records, as well as competitive spend data. So bringing this all together, basically, sort of the outcome from this was what people were suspecting, which is to say only some of the nodes are responsible for most of the bad customer experience. And so you can clearly prioritize those for maintenance and also prioritize those for capacity upgrades, right? So it's a great example that just totally would have been impossible without Hadoop. Let's talk about call detail records. This is probably still today the single biggest hit and the single biggest example of where Hadoop is being used in the telco industry. So a call detail record, anytime anything happens with your phone, on your phone, any sort of usage, notably calls, generates a call detail record. And that is a humongous volume of records, more than a typical carrier's more than 1 billion call detail records per day that are coming in. And clearly it's completely impossible to store this for more than a few days on legacy technology. But you do want to kind of keep the data a little bit longer because you use this for, for compliance, for billing disputes, for running analyses on your service quality. There's a couple of different uses that hang off the call detail records. And it's a wonderful example of how you can land this in Hadoop and because of the volume, you can retain it for a few years as opposed to just 60 days, which is what was possible with the legacy technology, right? Let's talk about service a little bit, customer care. One use here is to increase the productivity of your actual call center agents. There's two examples here. One is often people call in to basically say, look, I have a late fee here on my mobile phone bill. Can you waive the late fee, right? Mostly happens in the US because some people still pay with paper checks. Other countries outlawed that a long time ago, but that's just a side note. Anyway, so people call, want to have their fee waived. And in this case, doing a voice to text, you could actually analyze those text files and you find out that, hey, it's kind of silly that the call center agent, which costs about $30, $35 per call center hour, fully loaded with facilities, wages, telco, they spend their time on the $25 late fee waiver. That's kind of silly. So you can offload that to interactive voice recognition or self-service, right? And then the second example here is often people call about charges, about data charges, like why am I having such and such an amount here on my bill for data usage? And traditionally, the call center agent didn't have good data at their fingertips. It was just not part of the traditional systems. So again, you can provide that insight to the call center agent. So that's good. That's not bad. That's interesting. But the call center, of course, also is sort of the broker, I should say, to what's going on in the field in terms of all the truck rolls. You always see the T-Mobile or AT&T trucks or Comcast trucks going around. And often what happens when the customer calls the call center, the agent doesn't always have a good way of diagnosing the problem. Like, is the problem really, with the network, with stuff that's out there, or is the problem really in your home, your equipment, your configuration, what have you. And so the easy way out for the call center agent is to say, I'm going to send out a truck and they're going to check it out and you'll be fine. And so that's sort of the easy way out for the call center agent. But it's not an optimum situation because half the time, well, not half the time, but a fair percentage of the time, the truck goes out, it's $150 per truck roll at least, only to find that the problem is really in the network, it's not on the customer premise. So huge potential for cost savings. I'm going to pause for a water break as we go to the marketing side. So on the marketing side, what's the situation? Well, if you're like Deutsche Telekom or any large carrier like AT&T, you have, so the situation is you have multiple people in a household, right? Please.
Another quick question, sorry to interrupt, but as we go through these use cases, I wanted to know if you can tell us how many of these Deutsche Telekom implemented.
Sure. So there is a tremendous amount of sensitivity around what exactly has Deutsche Telekom implemented in what market, and I suspect other carriers have the same, right? And that's for two reasons. One reason is there is huge reputational downside, with big data, notably in the European market. People are much more concerned about it than in the US, so there's sensitivity there. And there's also sensitivity because a lot of this, of course, drives competitive advantage. So this is about as detailed a disclosure as you're going to get on what's going on at DT, but also at some other organizations that I've observed and peers that I've spoken with, right? So it's a very sensitive topic, but thank you for the question. All right, so what's going on here now? So you have a household like my family, and different people in the household, and they have a mobile phone. They have, well, have several mobile phones. Maybe some are prepaid for the kids, some are postpaid. They have, at home you have triple play, quadruple play. You may subscribe to some over-the-top services. So basically you have this boatload of services that you're sort of getting from the telco, but often you're getting it, different people have subscribed to different things, your kids, your wife, et cetera. And often this gets provided by different business units, and some of them may have been acquired in. And so you're sort of lacking a single unified view of the customer, and that's exactly what Hadoop allows you to do. Because of schema on read, you can, in fact, dump or stream, I should say, to use a technical, you can stream all this data into your common data lake, and you, for the first time, perhaps for the first time, you actually can see your total customer value across the household. And that's a hugely valuable insight. And you can use this insight for a variety of purposes. One of this is, of course, much more personalized marketing campaigns. And those campaigns, for instance, can be partially based on what's going on with your mobile phone, not just your location and your usage, but also some URL filtering around, okay, so what websites do you go to? And you can use this natively to actually increase, handset sales or increase sales of higher priced or higher margin rate plans, right? But all sorts of sort of personalized campaigns, and the value there is huge in terms of increasing what we call ARPU, the average revenue per customer or per user. You can also use it for upselling and cross-selling. Believe it or not, out there in the country, there's still a lot of people with feature phones. Not everyone. Here in Silicon Valley, it's just, I haven't seen a feature phone in ages, but apparently they still exist out in the wild. And so you can use this for upselling and cross-selling certain demographics on smartphones, right? You can also use it for next product to buy. And so as these telco product portfolios have broadened, for the point of sale frontline person, it's often kind of hard to really, you wonder why some of that stuff doesn't sell, and there's lots of reasons perhaps, but one reason is that the frontline point of sale person, sells what's most comfortable to them, what they're familiar with, not necessarily the stuff that has the highest conversion rate. And so in the online world, of course, we've optimized the wazoo out of this, but in the real world, bricks and mortar world, where you have points of sale, et cetera, there's huge potential here to generate recommendations based on Hadoop. So it's an instance of a recommendation engine, basically, right? Churn reduction, this is another very important one. Churn has been with the mobile industry since, of course, the inception, since the early 90s. But what's interesting with the more sophisticated insights you get out of Hadoop, you can actually try and reduce churn before it even happens. And one way to do this is to try and acquire fewer bad customers, right? So you can run analyses that say, look, XYZ kind of customer tends to churn out with a high probability, and depending on the handset subsidy regime, et cetera, that's costly. It's costly in any case. So how do we perhaps make it so that that person is not so incented to sign up versus other folks that are less likely to churn, right? Then let's talk about new and adjacent businesses. So clearly actionable intelligence serving advertisers is one example. I've shown one little picture here. This is a map of Berlin. It's real estate, and Deutsche Telekom owns the largest real estate listing site probably in Europe, with many, many millions of listings and so forth. And clearly that serves both real estate companies, landlords, tenants, people looking for stuff to buy or to rent. And basically on top of this, a very small team basically of developers used Hadoop to provide additional insights to the sell side, to the real estate agents and to the landlords. It's things like inventory depth, price trending, et cetera, so that if you're trying to sell your house, you can basically optimize your price point or how that's presented, right? This also works in conjunction with payment processors. Some telcos have deals with payment processors, where basically one use case here is to reduce fraud. So as you know, Europe's, going to a foreign country in Europe is like going to a different state here in the US in terms of distance. So lots of folks are outside of their country a fair amount of the time. And that's where a fair chunk of the fraud happens. And so the very simple idea here that's powered by Hadoop is to say, well, if I have a card-present transaction in Rome, but I know that the subscriber is in London physically based on the SIM card, that's kind of weird. Maybe there's a fraud going on. So 95% of the people that were pinged here opted into this service, and it's hugely helpful for cutting down the incidence of fraud. Another interesting use case is in the law enforcement federal government space. So Europe has large porous borders with Eastern Europe and the Southeast. It's not as fortified as the Mexican-US border. Think of it more as like the Canadian border. Lots of people live around, and it's fairly permeable at some point. And so here a use case with the law enforcement agency was to say, well, we're going to track the travel patterns based on the SIM cards, based on the IMEIs, in the proximity of the border, notably on the EU side of that border. And if we detect, there are certain patterns that are more likely to be traffic that's undesirable. Either people are smuggling goods or smuggling, people smuggling, arms smuggling, drug smuggling, you name it. And so this really increases the hit rate of the law enforcement agencies because they have a very finite set of resources, and so they can pinpoint their interceptions to just a few vehicles that are somehow suspicious. So again, that's a use case that natively uses Hadoop. Let's talk about a little bit of the lessons learned overall here on the next 2 pages from these use cases and also from conversations with many of my peers in the industry. So security obviously was always a big concern in these broader deployments. XA Secure, which is now part of Hortonworks, that's a huge step forward, of course, for the industry, but also realize that internal security sign-offs, they're always going to be somewhat complicated, no matter what. And in fact, as I've shown earlier, to the extent that these silos are dissolved and you're going to an enterprise-wide data lake, more and more of these considerations pop up. So you just have to be aware of that, and you have to be very aggressive about almost like pitching and negotiating with your CISO to say, look, as we've seen in the panel with Bank of New York, for instance, they're deploying Hadoop in very security-conscious environments. So it can be done. It's a negotiation exercise with your chief information security officer to convince them that the way things are done now in Hadoop actually still meets their security and compliance outcomes, right? Data quality, interesting learning there. If you start more with structured data, and it's more about perhaps the volume of that data, then data quality is not so much of an issue, and it becomes more of an issue as you go towards more unstructured data use cases where, the data quality kind of pops up as a topic. Then another important one is coordination. So as you imagine a situation where lots of departments are producing data and consuming, so everyone is sort of a consumer and a producer at the same time, you really need to establish some coordination mechanism. It's almost like a social network internally around, okay, so I'm producing XYZ set of data, and here's the metadata that describes it, and by the way, I promise to give everyone an alert here in this network before I change anything because others are relying on it. So that's also a huge thing. Now, on the business side, sponsorship. Can't overemphasize the importance of the sponsorship. In some organizations, even the CEO looks at new use cases and signs those off. And just you can never underinvest on this thing around executive alignment, sponsorship, internal communications. That's just hugely important to the success of this. And make sure that the ownership for projects always sits with the business first and foremost. Otherwise, you can find a situation where it creates some operational value, but it sort of plateaus because the business is not sufficiently on board. And speaking of onboarding, you probably want to, the number 10 here, there's no magic to it, but certainly a lot of large enterprises that I've spoken with, they seem to be onboarding like a dozen or so a year, sometimes even more. And governance. Governance is difficult. Deutsche Telekom, for instance, is a very federated, very decentralized organization. And if you don't have a strong top-down, okay, we're all going to do this, one way to get this done is to have a CEO mandate where you create success in a few areas, and then that's a shining light, if you will, and the rest of the organization can opt in. So that's not a bad way to go if you don't have super strong, centralized, top-down mandates for this. Talk a little bit about funding and incentives. One way you can get around, so what's the problem with funding and incentives? The problem is I'm sharing my data, I'm making you successful, what's in it for me, right? And one way to get out of it is to say, look, we're actually going to pay you for the usage of your data, so there's some modest amount of money that gets you relief on your budget. And by the way, if you want my data, I want access to your data, so it's almost a peer-to-peer thing. So you can have these mechanics in place to incentivize that, right? And then finally, my last comment here, power plays. So data is capital, data is power. A data lake is a lot of power because a lot of power accrues to whoever sits on that, so prepare for some power plays around that. I think we're a little bit out of time with respect to questions, is that right? Okay, we are out of time, but I will be hanging out here, so feel free to come up, give me your card if you want the full version of the deck. Thank you.